maybe they're tired of, being in school, or they just want to be sure that law school is really the right next step for them. So I attended Northwestern University Law School in Chicago. I didn't have any connection to Chicago. I'd gone to school on the East Coast, and I thought I wanted to go back and probably practice in Boston. And I thought, oh, it'd be nice to live somewhere else for a while. I had some friends that were working in Chicago, so I went out there. And I had a great experience in law school. The summer after my first year, I worked for a white collar criminal defense firm. The attorney, there was one attorney and two associates, and he had 3 law students working for him during the summer. He had been a former federal defender, which interested me. And he was representing people in a really lengthy criminal trial the entire summer. I think I was there for 10 weeks, and I probably saw him 3 or 4 times that whole summer. So that was kind of an unusual experience. And then after my second summer, I worked for a big commercial law firm in Boston. I didn't really see myself doing that type of work representing corporations, but a friend of mine had worked there the summer before and really liked it. So I took that job. I had also had an offer from the US Attorney's Office in the Southern District of New York to work there for the summer, but they didn't pay. And back then there weren't really any ready sources of loans or anything. So number one, I could not afford not to make any money all summer. And number two, I certainly couldn't afford to live in New York City without earning any money. So, that was not a possible option for me. But luckily today, there are a lot more law schools that have funding for unfunded public interest internships. And then I ended up going back to the firm in Boston after I graduated. The work was really intellectually challenging, liked the people. They had a big commitment to doing pro bono work, representing clients free of charge. But after being there for a couple of years, I realized that the cases I felt most excited about working on were the pro bono cases where I was representing individuals. So in particular, a case where I represented a man in his 80s who was in an eviction proceeding, and he lived in subsidized housing. And that pretty much means if you're in subsidized housing and you get evicted, there's really nowhere else to go. So, kind of thought about that and realized I wanted to find a job where I was representing individuals who didn't have the means to hire a private attorney. So fortunately, the law school where I'd graduated from, Northwestern, had started a new program to try to encourage newer attorneys to become clinical law professors, because usually you have to have years and years of experience to do that. So I applied for the program and I got the job, and I ended up doing juvenile and criminal work in Chicago. So representing basically kids, under the age of 17 who were accused in either juvenile cases or who were being tried as adults in criminal cases in the court system, and did that for a while. And then I moved over to, there was an individuals with disabilities education clinic. So I was one of 3 of the lead attorneys on a class action that we filed, suing the Chicago Public Schools and the Illinois Board of Education. And we represented the 40,000 kids with disabilities in the Chicago public school system who were not being educated in the least restrictive environment. So that was a really exciting case to work on. We were in the federal court system. We ended up having to hire and work with a team of about 21 experts on that case. So it gave me a lot of great litigation experience. The case actually went on for 20 years, so it went on long after I had left the legal clinic, but ended up settling with the Chicago Board of Education, and then winning through the court system against the Illinois State Board of Education. But those were kind of some real highlights. And then eventually, once we moved to Maine, I ended up teaching at the University of Maine Law School, teaching some courses in trial practice and counseling and litigation. and then starting and running their externship program, which is essentially where students earn course credit to work with different legal organizations. And from there, kind of did another career change and realized I was kind of tired of litigation, but I really liked working with students on their career plans, and ended up from there going to Bates College to do pre-law advising there. And then about 6 years ago, coming to Bowdoin, where I do pre-law advising. I up until this semester, we now have a new advisor coming in. I have been doing government and policy advising as well. And I also work with alumni who are applying to law school, and I direct the advising side of things here. So that kind of, in a nutshell, has been my experience. But I think any lawyer you talk to is going to have a very different set of interests and different experiences that led them to law school. So I do have a PowerPoint. Sorry, you know what? I'll post the link again at the end. I just want to get the PowerPoint started. Okay. Okay, so these are the topics that I plan to cover today. It's really hard to fit this all into half an hour presentation. So also, obviously, if there are things I don't talk about or questions you don't get answered, please just set up an appointment through Handshake and come in and speak with me. I'm happy to do that. So what do lawyers do? Well, in a nutshell, a lot of different things. There are people who practice environmental law, international law, sports and entertainment law, immigration law. But whatever it is you do, if you have a law degree, it's either probably a Juris Doctor, a JD, or an LLB degree. It's the same thing. It gives you, entree both ways. It's a professional degree that allows you to be licensed and gives you access to represent clients in our administrative and judicial system before government agencies and in private legal matters. So this screen shows just a few of the many different practice areas that exist in law. And there are even more than this. When I went to law school, I don't even think there was such a thing as cybersecurity law. And the same will be true for you. There are areas, if you do go to law school, you may end up in practice in an area that doesn't even exist today. That's how fast things are changing. The other thing about law school is you don't pick a major when you go to law school. It's not like undergrad where you declare a major. So I'll talk a little bit later about the curriculum in law school, but except for first year when your courses are pretty much set, and everyone has to take a legal ethics course before they graduate. But other than that, you can take whatever you want. You could take all environmental law courses if that's what you wanted to do, and there were enough in the curriculum. Most people try to take courses that are going to show up on the bar exam and that are topics that they'll be tested on, but nobody is going to tell you that you have to do that. And in fact, at Yale Law School, you can take whatever you want. I don't even think first year there are any required courses. So it's kind of, you have complete freedom to learn what you'd like to learn about. So you might ask, okay, well, how do I learn about these different paths? If I don't have to declare a major, shouldn't I have some idea, maybe thinking about what I might want to do before I go to law school? And again, you don't have to. It does help to have a reason to go to law school, and we'll talk about that more. But many people go into law school thinking they might be interested in a certain area, and then they take a course and learn about a topic and just fall in love with that and decide that's the direction they want to go in. So these are some things I suggest. There is a podcast you can check out from LST Radio called I Am the Law. These are interviews with, I think it's about 50 maybe they have up now, lawyers in different practice areas, and it can be really helpful to learn about what it is they do. The Law School Admission Council, which is the publisher of the Law School Admission Test, and they're also the clearinghouse for law school applications. They have on their website kind of a little guide to different fields of law. And I'll send you the link to this. I'll send you this presentation afterwards so you can have these links. In Handshake, there is a law resources tab on there that you can check out as well. And then we don't have all our events set for the semester, but a few upcoming events you might want to know about. Cravath, Swaine and Moore, which is a global law firm based in New York. They're having an info session on January 27th that anyone can come to. They're going to specifically be talking about job opportunities for graduating seniors to work as paralegals. That's something you might want to check out. They'll probably talk about some of their practice areas too. I'll talk a little bit more about paralegal work in a sec. Elected Officials to Protect America is offering internships. And so there are different information sessions that are happening. This one is occurring on February 9th. I know some students last year who were interested both in policy and law school and the environment who've worked there before. When you're a senior, we have a mock paralegal interview program, and that's because more and more seniors have become interested in working as a paralegal, which is a paraprofessional position. You're assisting lawyers as they go about helping clients with cases. It can be in all different settings. It could be in a legal services office or a government agency, or many of the firms that recruit are large private firms. Professor Isaacson's firm, I think, has an open position for a paralegal right now. A number of firms in different cities as well. And sometimes students will do that just to kind of get a feel for what legal practice is like before they commit to law school. That's also a good way to just develop some great marketable skills, everything from, research to communications to project management that you can use in a variety of different settings. And then we have something called Law Day that's coming up on April 8th. We do this every year. It's hosted at the University of Maine School of Law. Hopefully this year we can hold this in person. But we have a professor who teaches a mock law class. It's actually a real law class, but they send out the materials ahead of time. You're required to do the reading, and then he or she may call on the participants. There are also Bates and Colby students that join with us in this. We have a mock admissions panel with admissions officers from different schools, not just University of Maine. And then we'll have alumni who are current law students that can answer questions about their experiences. And then other things I'd recommend: connecting with alumni. I know some of you have already had networking calls with alumni who are lawyers. I can connect you with others. You know how to find them now on LinkedIn. And it's a great way to just get information about what their current experience is like, what they do in their day-to-day jobs, and what law school is like for them. And then internships. I would say internships in private firms or organizations where you're actually kind of doing the work closely to an attorney who's representing a client. Those are kind of few and far between for undergrads because there's so many law students that want these experiences, but it is possible. Sometimes they exist, and sometimes different organizations offer opportunities, or it's even valuable just to get experience using the kinds of skills that you need to use as a lawyer, writing, research, communication skills, working in a business setting, because so much of legal practice is about the business of business, not all of it. You could work in a court system too. I do have a sheet that I'll be handing out tomorrow in the industry meetups, but I can also email it to everybody who's attended this meeting, just with kind of past internships people have had and things that have been offered through Handshake. While we're talking about different practice areas of law, I just wanted to show you this statistic because I think it's kind of a good reality check. So this figure shows reported full-time salaries for the class of 2020. And this is nationally of law school graduates. So a couple of things that are interesting to note. So you might see that very high spike on the end of the graph, 190,000. It'd be nice to think that that's what all lawyers earn when they graduate from law school, but that is not the case. There are actually even some higher salaries that were excluded from the graph just because they were kind of so outside the norm. But if you look at this other peak on the left side, those are salaries that range from 45,000 to 75,000 that collectively account for about half of the reported salaries, okay? So the right-hand peak, the 190,000 is about 21% of reported salaries. But because there were some that were so far at the end that really skewed it, they adjusted the mean. So you can see that adjusted mean is 97,000, but that doesn't mean that that's what most lawyers actually earn. So you can see there's quite a range of salaries. And you might ask, well, what determines that? A lot of it is what type of law are you practicing? Where are you practicing? You know, if you are in a large global law firm, chances are your salary is going to be much higher than if you have your own office representing kind of a general practice, you know, divorces, maybe criminal defense, some other cases in a small town in another part of the country. But that's not always the case. I mean, some lawyers have very high earnings in many different parts of the country, but, you know, just to show there really is a range. So you need to think about, we'll talk more about what does law school cost in a minute, but just realizing that there is a very large salary range depending on geographic area and practice area. Sometimes people want to know, what are some other possible careers I could have if I don't want to pursue a law degree, but I have, you know, I have these interests or skills that I want to use. We talked a little bit about paralegal work. Some people do that professionally for the long term. There's also compliance work. What that is basically, you know, as you know, there are federal regulations that touch so many different sectors and areas. I mean, from Medicaid regulations in the healthcare industry, environmental regulations, financial regulations. And so many private companies and even public, you know, you could be a hospital who has a compliance unit because you have to make sure you're complying with Medicaid and other rules and regulations. You don't have to be a lawyer necessarily. There are lawyers who do that type of work, but many of those jobs don't require a law degree. Social work. If law is a helping profession, just as social work is, and there are a number of schools that have joint degree programs with law and social work. So that's another possibility. Working in the court system, you know, everything from working in the judiciary, being a judge, supporting judges as law clerks, working in court administration, working in a probation office. There are lots of different opportunities if you're interested in the judicial system. Politics, you know, how many politicians do you also hear about who are lawyers? Working in academia and also journalism. If you're someone who's interested in policy, or you've ever wondered about working in a think tank, which can be kind of quasi-policy, but more taking a deep dive into the research. Many of the researchers that you find in those centers are either lawyers, professors, or journalists. So there are a lot of different possibilities. And if you think, you know, law might not be the path for me, but I'd like to find out what else I could do, come and see me. We can certainly have a conversation about that. Sorry, it's not advancing. Okay. Okay. So how do you know if you're ready to choose to apply to law school? I would say there are a few questions you should ask yourself. Do you need a law degree to do what you want to do? Yes, there are certainly people who do go to law school and never end up practicing law, but it can be a very expensive education that maybe they don't absolutely need. And, you know, because we're going to look at the cost of law school in a minute, just that's something to keep in mind. It's also, you know, at least 3 years out of your life when you're not earning anything, if you're going full time and you're not advancing in your career. Do you have a good idea of what lawyers do? Do you know what you're getting into if you're going to law school? What will be the actual cost of your law degree, and what effect will any debt you incur have on your other life's goals? Do you know what lawyers earn in the field you want to practice in? And what is the employment data from the schools you were thinking about attending? So fortunately, law schools are all required to produce this type of employment data. They're called 509 reports, and you can get those for any law school. But it used to be not too long ago that schools could say, oh, we have a 95% employment rate from this graduating class. And that sounds wonderful, but they didn't have to break it down by what the graduates were actually doing. And now each school has to report in specific categories, and probably the one that's of most interest to people considering law school is how many students are employed in long-term, full-time jobs that require that they have passed the bar, because that's what most people who go to law school imagine that they're going to be doing when they graduate. And then preparation. So the American Bar Association, which is the professional association for lawyers, has a statement about what type of preparation is required for law school. And basically, they don't recommend any particular major. And if you read through this, I'll just give you a sec to do that. It kind of makes me think when I read it, well, you know, if you graduate from Bowdoin, you're in a pretty good position to be able to be successful in law school. And I really do think that is the case. I will say, if you major in an area where you're not having to write many lengthy papers, you may want to take a little more coursework in that area or get that experience, because you will be doing a lot of writing and a ton of reading in law school. And we'll talk more about that in a sec. The other thing I like about this statement is they do recommend that you work with your pre-law advisor. So I'm just going to put in a plug for that. It's not just about, you know, what are the nuts and bolts for my application, but there are a lot of different types of strategies that come into play. Everything from when should I take the test? Should I take the test a second time? What are the pros and cons of doing it? I got waitlisted. What can I do to increase my chances of getting off the wait list? Or I got into the school. I'm so happy about this, but they didn't offer me enough financial aid. Is there anything I can do about that? And the other nice thing is that even when you graduate from Bowdoin, you can still access pre-law advising. So in fact, most Bowdoin grads end up applying to law school 1 to 3 years after they graduate. So a lot of the people I work with every year are actually alumni. Okay, so what are some of the core skills, values, knowledge, and experience that you need? And these are the ones that are actually listed by the ABA. I would agree with them. Probably have a couple things I'd add. Most of these are pretty self-explanatory. And again, when you look at this list, it's pretty compelling when you see how many of these skills you are going to develop while you're at Bowdoin, whether you intentionally set out to do that or not. I would say oral communication and listening. A lot of times people don't really think of lawyers as listeners, but more talkers. But that is so important in being a successful lawyer. You really have to know how to listen to people. Organization and management. It doesn't just mean managing other people, but especially managing large amounts of information or thinking strategically and being able to identify and advance objectives, or create a structure so that you can achieve a desired result. And that's why I think, you know, thinking about what are skills I can develop in this way in so many different areas. It doesn't have to be through a legal internship, right? I mean, you can apply it in athletics teamwork, or, you know, maybe in some leadership positions in clubs, or a volunteer opportunity. Also, maybe I'm idealistic, but public service and the promotion of justice, I think as a lawyer, at the end of the day, really all you have is your integrity. And that's a really key thing to think about as you're thinking about applying. Gaining any type of experience assisting others. Again, it doesn't have to be assisting others on an individual basis, but lawyers have to take an oath to be dedicated to the promotion of justice and to serve their clients. And when you're a lawyer, you are a lawyer 24/7, right? It doesn't matter if it's a holiday weekend, if your client has a need within reason, but the courthouse is always open, basically. So it is a 24/7. It's not an occupation, it's a profession. Relationship building and collaboration. Again, lawyers often have a reputation of not being able to get along with people. And sometimes that's just kind of a negotiating tactic, but it's really important to have good developed interpersonal skills. And that's something law schools really do look at evidence of. How do you interact with your classmates? What are your professors who are writing your letters of recommendation going to say about that in their recommendations? You've got to be able to gain your clients' trust. So interpersonal skills are really important. And then some background knowledge, understanding how our system of government works is important. I think understanding a little bit about business is really important. You don't have to have internships in the business sector, but when I went to law school, I didn't know anything about the corporate world, didn't know anything about business. And these terms would come up when I had contracts. The professor would talk about different business terms. And luckily, my apartment mate had been a business major in college. And so she filled me in on everything I needed to know. But I did wish maybe I'd read the New York Times business section a little bit, or, just had some other basic knowledge of some of the vocabulary. Understanding about world events, a little bit of knowledge about world institutions, an understanding of world cultures, both within and outside the US, are really important as well. And exposure to the law, that's not a requirement for admission, but I think, anything that you can do to build your knowledge about what are different practice areas and what is the practice of law really like before you make that decision to go to law school is helpful. So what's law school like? If you pursue a degree full-time, it'll take 3 years and you have the summers off, and people usually do internships during the summer. If you go part-time, it's a 4-year degree. During the summer, law students do have, instead of being called internships, they're called clerkships. They didn't used to be as popular first year, but now more and more students do have clerkships after their first year. And then that second summer, many students will try to get a clerkship that is likely to lead to a permanent job offer when they graduate. And then the day-to-day commitment of law school can really vary depending upon whether you attend a national, a regional, or a local law school. Being a law student might feel like, or might be actually, a full-time occupation that's going to leave you little time for family, friends, another job, much of a social life. It's or, at some law schools, it could be more like a 9-to-5 weekday job. So it really depends. Those things can vary, just as the amount of reading that you'll have to do for your classes varies with the school. Your nightly reading amounts might be short, but oftentimes it requires a lot of thought. And mostly you will be reading appellate court cases. So the first level would be a trial court. And then if one of the parties wants to appeal the decision, it goes to an appellate court, where there's not usually a new trial, but it's more a review of the court record. And so you're reading the judicial opinions about what happens in those appellate cases. And then you're going to be answering questions that pose hypothetical questions regarding the manipulation of the facts of those cases. And you'll have to answer whether or not the holding or the court's ruling would change and why it would change. And oh yeah, usually in most first year classes, you're getting called on and you have to kind of go through the Socratic method exercise with the professor in front of the whole class. So most law schools are not, at least first year, it's not taught in a lecture format, and even second and third year, they tend to be more seminar style courses. But the good news is usually your first year, you're only with the same group of students. I say only, but you get to know them really well. So there were 100 students in my first year section, but we all knew each other pretty well by the end of the year. And okay, so I mentioned professors use the Socratic or the case method in teaching. The other thing is, especially first year, you will receive little, if any, feedback from professors during the semester, and your entire grade might be based on your final exam, which is usually open book. And these are the courses, the required curriculum that most law schools teach: criminal law, property law, legal writing, constitutional law. Usually that can be a second year class too. Oh, I forgot evidence. Usually that's not always first year. Contracts, civil procedure, and torts, which are kind of injuries to parties, like whether it's a car accident or intentional infliction of emotional distress, that kind of thing. The admissions process is different than it is in undergrad. So first of all, there's an admission test required. Every school accepts the law school admission test. Some schools will also accept the graduate record exam, or the GRE. I'm not going to be able to go into much about the tests right now because that could actually be a separate workshop, but I will just say both tests now you can take on your computer at home. The LSAT has 4 sections, really 5, but the sections are: there's reading comprehension, there's a logical reasoning section, and an analytical reasoning section. And then there's another section that's an experimental one, and you can't always tell what that section is. You might be able to guess, but you can't tell. So you still have to do your best and take it seriously when you're taking the test. And then there's also a writing sample that's required, but you do that at a separate time. And it's not scored, but schools can see that writing sample. And you usually get your results about 3 weeks after taking the test. The GRE has 2 sections. There's a verbal section, or a verbal section, and then a quantitative section. It's really, they say it's more high school level math, but talking to people who've taken it recently, even if you're pretty good at quant skills, you might want to do some brushing up on it. The nice thing about the GRE is that you get your score immediately at the end of the test, except there's also a writing sample that again is ungraded, but you don't get that. Well, it's a score, but law schools don't really look at the score in that way, but you don't get your writing sample back for, I think it takes about 2 weeks. You also need to submit a resume, a transcript, a personal statement, and then 1 to 2 letters of recommendation. And at least one of them has to be from a faculty member who's taught you in a course. Some schools actually require 2 letters of recommendation from faculty members. And then only some schools offer or require interviews, but some of them do. And then the employment outcomes and the bar passage statistics, that is what percentage of their graduating seniors successfully pass the bar within so many months of graduating. Those are published, and they can vary greatly among schools. And what it means to pass the bar is that's what you have to do in order, if there's an exam, and you can't be licensed until you've passed the bar. And you've also submitted what's called the character and fitness application to the Board of Bar Overseers. And then another difference is that financial aid is awarded both, well, it can be both on need or academic merit. So need is kind of obvious, right? There's some schools that it doesn't matter how great your scores or your GPA might be. If you cannot demonstrate financial aid, you will not receive any grants or scholarship from them. most law students end up financing the bulk of their law school education through loans that they take out. And if you're a US citizen, the federal government, pretty much you can get loans up to what's called the cost of attendance, which means not just tuition and fees, but also your cost of living, which each school determines what the cost of living is. But the bad news is, whatever you borrow in loans, you have to pay back. There are some federal programs and some school-based programs that if you go directly into a public service career or sometimes public interest career, even working for government agencies, you might get some of your loan forgiven, but they're very specific requirements and there are certain types of loans that qualify. So if that's something that might be of interest, you really need to check in with your law school's financial aid office. And then academic merit is the term that schools use to reward kind of the higher ranking in terms of LSAT and GPA, or it could be GRE, but GRE has just been much less common so far in the admissions process. But anyway, those students that are in the 75th percentile or above that are getting the big financial aid awards because of where they are in the applicant pool. So for that reason, it's a really good idea to apply to a school that might be a safety school for you, even if it's not your first choice school, because it's always nice to kind of go into this process having a full tuition scholarship in your back pocket. Okay, so I just wanted to show you a little bit about what I'm talking about. This is the admissions profile for American University Law School. We're going to look at fall 2020. I know I have other years on here, but every school has to publish for the LSAT. And now as more schools are accepting the GRE, you'll be able to see their GRE scores as well. But most schools, right now, you'll only see the LSAT scores. 25th percentile, 50th, and 75th percentile of admitted students scores for the fall of 2020. And the same thing with the GPA. So you can see kind of the 50th percentile was a 160 LSAT score. And you can see the LSAT scores nationally, and this is true everywhere, range from 120 to 180. So American, most of the admitted students had a 160 or above, and most of them had a GPA of a 3.51 or above. I always usually get asked, and it's a great question, well, isn't there any kind of like bump that I get from going to Bowdoin because the coursework is more rigorous here than in a lot of other schools? You don't in terms of the pure numbers, they don't add anything on, but they will definitely look at your transcript, and most law schools know Bowdoin and know the academic rigor, and they will take that into account when they're evaluating your transcript. So what else can we see here? All schools, well, we know that American does admit some students below a 154 and who have below a 3.22 GPA. And that's the big question, right? Like if you're applying and it's a reach school for you, what is it? We don't know. What is it about that particular student's application that set them apart from the other students that were below the 25th percentile? Why did they get in? And so if you're in a position where you're kind of reaching to apply to a school, you're below their median or below their 25th percentile, you really have to think about what do I have that can set me apart and make them, go ahead and admit me, even though I'm kind of outside their profile. I will say too, it's not only a numbers game. So I almost even hesitate to show this, but I think, you do need to understand how to look at these numbers. But schools beyond the numbers are also looking at other factors. I would say your faculty recommendations and your other letters of recommendations are important. What you've done with your experience during the last 4 years is important. The choices that you've made. It's not always about where you've worked, but what have you been involved in outside of academia? And we can talk about that in a minute. And then I wanted to show you this slide about fees. And this is tuition and fees. This is per year, actually, okay? So the average private law school is going to be $51,000. And so remember, this is not the cost of living. So obviously, if you're living in New York City, it's going to cost you more money than living in Tulsa, Oklahoma for the year. And they also have the highest price law school for the last academic year in terms of tuition and fees was Columbia. The lowest private one was Tulsa. If you are an in-state student at a public university or a law school rather, you can expect to pay about $29,000 on average. And then if you're an out-of-state student at a public institution, it's about $42,000. And you should look really carefully too, because some states make it much easier to claim state residency than others, or in some states, you may be able to claim state residency after you've been there for a year. So that's another aspect to consider. Okay. What should I be doing right now? I would say number one, pay attention to academics, because whether you apply as an alum or first semester senior, your GPA is whatever it will be. And remember, most people apply in the fall of your senior year. So you're going to be having your application evaluated before you even have your first semester senior grades in. So your GPA, you know, it's not suddenly going to change. I mean, it might go up some from your, you know, after you get your first semester senior grades in, but it's really important to focus on that now. As I mentioned before, you know, lengthy papers, critical thinking are important, developing those skills. Attend some faculty office hours if you haven't yet, because you are going to be asking at least one faculty member, maybe two, to write letters of recommendation for you. If it's not for law school, it could be for something else. So get to know them. It's also a great way to find out sometimes when you're having a conversation with them, the topic of summer internships might come up, and a lot of them will get emails from alumni who may not think of contacting the Career Center to post something on Handshake, and faculty might know of things. So that's can be a good source of information as well. As I said before, get involved in one or two things outside of academics, because you want to have something to put on your resume that shows you're engaged in your community. And it's going to be different things for different students. For some people, it might be working 2 or 3 part-time jobs on campus. For other people, you might be involved in athletics, or maybe volunteer work outside, or maybe you have an internship, or you're involved in a student organization. It doesn't have to be, you know, being the president of 10 clubs at all, but it just has to show that you are doing something besides going to class while you're here. Make sure you identify your career interests in Handshake. If you want to get the email from me that I send out, you have to check off, I think it's legal or law enforcement. I think that's what it's under. Explore summer legal programs. There are some great ones out there. They're not required, but especially for students from backgrounds that are underrepresented in the practice of law or who've been historically excluded. And that can really range. You have to read the definition of the programs. It can encompass a lot of different identities, including first-generation college students or students from economically disadvantaged households. So, you know, read the definitions. I have another slide that has the link to the database for researching those programs, but sometimes they're all free of charge. Sometimes they pay a stipend for you to attend. Usually they're 4 to 6 weeks long in the summer. They talk about LSAT prep. It's not an LSAT prep course, but talk about what to expect in law school, introducing you to different legal practice areas, and they take place in all different parts of the country. A lot of the applications are opening soon or just starting to open now, and most of them are due in the next couple of months. They're open to first years and sophomores, and then there are even some programs for juniors or seniors, but you can see that if you look at the database. And then I would say schedule a pre-law advising appointment with me, just to even talk about this. I would say if you plan to apply as a senior, make sure you see me by January of your junior year. If you're not planning to apply until after law school, you know, any time is fine. But the reason I say January is a really popular time to take one of the admission tests is the summer before senior year. And you need to have a plan for when you're going to do that and how you're going to prepare. And since you should really spend 2 to 4 months studying, not full time, but 2 to 4 months studying, if you get that plan in place by January, February, you'll have time to, enough time to go through it. And then in the future, learning about the LSAT or the GRE. Those are the websites for the publishers of both. Law school admission counselor has fee waivers for income eligible students. The process of applying to law school is really expensive. So that's something else that we could talk about, or you could check out on their website. Accommodations for test takers with disabilities. That's something you have to apply for at least 6 weeks before you plan to register for the test. Great booklet on financing your legal education, as well as the diversity summer programs, and the law school scholarship data bank is available from this website, accesslex.org. And they also have online something called Max Pre-Law, which is a great resource for anybody who's considering law school.